All right, welcome everybody to the first inaugural narrated version of Chapter 13, the spinal cord and spinal nerves. I'm glad that my handy dandy laser pointer is working as well. So what are we going to talk about in this chapter? In Chapter 12, we went to long lengths to explain how a single neuron works, how it creates an action potential, how it moves that action potential in the form of a nerve impulse, and how the neuron passes on that nerve impulse to the postsynaptic neuron using that chemical synapse to transfer a nerve impulse. So our nervous system is made up of 130, 150 billion of these neurons, and they form very large gross anatomical structures when they appear in large masses. And those gross anatomical structures have particular functions. At the very beginning of Chapter 12, we mentioned the sensory, integrating, and motor functions of our nervous system. So we have, according to that specialization, sensory, integrating, and motor neurons. The largest integrating organs are the brain and spinal cord. And so we are looking at first the integrating gross anatomical structures that allow the spinal cord to act as an integrating organ in our nervous system. And the last part of this chapter, we will be looking at physiological actions, just how is this integration is carried out by the spinal cord. The spinal nerves are nothing else but connections to and from the spinal cord. Nerve impulses will have to enter and exit the spinal cord, and spinal nerves, part of the peripheral nervous system, is going to serve that purpose. Our entire goal here is to look at how those spinal nerves come about and how they branch to reach their destinations. So spinal cord has a major role as a coordinating, integrating action in our nervous system, and because our nervous system allows us to react to changes in the environment, the spinal cord has a major role in it, and of course spinal nerves, where those nerve impulses move, have a major role in that too. So besides being the site for integration, our spinal cord, as we'll see very shortly, also has huge bundles of superhighways for nerve impulses. These conduction pathways, we'll be calling them tracts, all in the white matter portion of the spinal cord. And as you can imagine, integration done by the cell bodies, dendrites, are in the gray matter portion of the spinal cord. We'll see examples in the or in the physiology part of this chapter: excitatory postsynaptic potential and inhibitory postsynaptic potential. This will be a really good illustration of those phenomena and the needs for that. And it is the spinal cord where we are introduced to this concept called reflex. Reflex, and we'll be specially mentioning reflex arcs towards the end of this chapter. Reflexes are the basic wiring circuitry of our nervous system. We have thousands of different reflexes. Reflexes are hardwired reactions to changes in the environment, and so very quickly, in a matter of milliseconds, our nervous system can create a response to save our life, to react to something, so we can maintain homeostasis. With the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, we have to say a few words about what's around the spinal cord. And of course, we have the bony protection, the vertebrae. You saw all vertebrae have vertebral foramen. Even in the sacrum, we have that sacral canal. But inside that vertebral foramen, there is an extra layers of protective material which are called the meninges. So we are going to take a closer look, especially because cerebrospinal fluid moves in between two particular layers of that meninges. So this is the best way to look at what are the meninges. In the very first lab, we talked about membranes lining organs in body cavities. Here the membrane has three layers to it, and here you can see the spinal cord with the beginnings of the spinal nerves here. So this tube-like sheeting along the spinal cord is what's called meninges. On the very outside, this greenish material is called the dura or dura mater. This is a very tough and fairly thick sheet. This gives probably the most physical protection to the spinal cord. Underneath this pinkish, maybe slightly purplish layer of the meninges is the arachnoid matter. Between the two layers, between the dura and the arachnoid, there's tissue fluid that's layered here. Fluid layers can provide protection against side impact to the spinal cord. Not a whole lot, but it is a lot better than nothing. So let's say if you fall off the roof, you fall on your side, the spinal cord is not going to be jamming into the vertebrae, the bony material, but there are two layers of cushioning liquid, and the first layer here is tissue fluid. The third layer of the meninges is the pia matter. This is a very thin layer. It's stuck on the surface of the spinal cord, and it goes into every nook and cranny. Between the arachnoid and the pia is where this very special fluid circulates, the cerebrospinal fluid. In the brain chapter, we'll see that cerebrospinal fluid is made in the brain, and that fluid circulates all the way to the end of the spinal cord. So this is the place of confinement for the cerebrospinal fluid between the arachnoid and the pia matters of the meninges. Before we go into details of spinal nerves, let's take a look at what the spinal cord has for us in terms of gross anatomy. And it's so easy to imagine. I'm going to move back. Can I move back one slide? Maybe not. The spinal cord is not a rod-like structure of uniform diameter throughout the entire vertebral column. So we do have widenings. These are called enlargement in the cervical area, and we also have a lumbar enlargement where the spinal cord is a little thicker, and so it's not uniform diameter all the way through. And also when you look at the very end of the spinal cord, our actual cord, the solid rod spinal cord, ends at about a lumbar 2 vertebra. So That is because the growth of the spinal cord doesn't follow our growth during childhood and puberty. So as our body grows, the spinal cord is going to be looking shorter and shorter position in the vertebral canal. So at the inferior end of the spinal cord, we see the following situation. Here it is, we're approaching L2 here, and the spinal cord tapers into a sharp-looking end. This is called a conus medullaris. And then what we have is a bundle of spinal nerves. If you hold in your hand maybe 15, 20 strands of cooked spaghetti, that's what it actually looks like. And if we had a chance to go to a cadaver lab trip, we would be handed a dissected spinal cord with the cauda equinae. That's this bundle of spinal nerves. We also have a structure that is not seen very clearly here, the filum terminale. Once the conus medullaris comes to a point, the pia mater continues as a strand and anchors the spinal cord all the way to the coccyx. Again, it's not shown very clearly on this artist's rendition. So these are the surprising anatomical aspects of the spinal cord. When we look at a transverse section of the spinal cord, we see darker and lighter areas. So we mentioned this way back in chapter 12 that myelination, insulation of axons lead to a whiter appearing material, the white matter. So the gray matter looks more like brownish on this preparation. So the gray matter has cell bodies and neurons, any axons that are unmyelinated, or the dendrites. The gray matter is divided into horns. So we have the anterior, the posterior horns. The feature that's kind of hard to see is a tiny pinhole here. This is the central canal. Cerebrospinal fluid is flowing through this. This is how cerebrospinal fluid gets all the way to the end of the spinal cord. This is connected with the brain. In the white matter of the spinal cord, we are seeing only myelinated axons, and this will be the area, the tracts that will be carrying nerve impulses up and down the spinal cord. So larger segments of the white matter are organized or called columns. We have the posterior column, the lateral column, and we have the anterior column. So this is all information, nerve impulse, superhighways in our spinal cord. This is the illustration of how information is getting into or out of the spinal cord. Our nervous system, and if you remember that box-shaped diagram at the beginning of chapter 12, we have sensory neurons that are bringing nerve impulses to the integrating center. So sensory neurons are illustrated here in blue, and you can see the arrow is pointing towards the spinal cord. So nerve impulses are flowing into the spinal cord through the sensory part of the spinal nerve, while motor nerve impulses that instruct muscles or glands, are moving out of the spinal cord along the red line, along the red arrow. Motor branch or root of this spinal nerve is always anterior. The sensory is always posterior. It is interesting how this is separated completely just before entry into the spinal cord. And the sensory portion has an interesting structure, a swelling called a dorsal root ganglion. And you can see that cell bodies of sensory neurons, such as cell bodies of Meissner, Pacini corpuscle, are all located here, close to the spinal cord. In terms of spinal nerves, the number is very similar to the vertebrae in the vertebral column. Biggest differences with the cervical region. The first pair of cervical spinal nerves exiting between the occipital bone and atlas, and so that is the additional cervical nerve. Instead of 7, the number of cervical vertebrae, we have 8 pairs of cervical nerves, but the others, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, are matching very well. Coccygeal, again, much fewer than the actual fused vertebrae there. So here's the statement mixed about spinal nerves. There's both sensory and motor nerves, and this goes back to the fact that a spinal nerve roughly carries half motor and half sensory axons. That was on a previous slide. With the spinal nerves, we'll be looking at branching pattern, and just like with the muscles, we are looking at connective tissue coverings of axons or bundles of axons. This is maybe even weirder than what we saw in a muscle. When you think about a nerve, you don't think about connective tissues covering each and every axon, but that's what the endoneurium is, and we have the bundling of axons by perineurium. An entire nerve is surrounded by a connective tissue sheet called epineurium. So this is what this looks like under the electron microscope. Here we have individual axons sometimes showing their endoneurium. You can see several bundles of axons. These are larger oval structures. This sheet-like material around them is the perineurium, and around this entire nerve, and maybe it's better to switch here, around the entire nerve there is a connective tissue sheeting called the epineurium. So why is this, how could this be useful in any particular way? Think about the spinal nerve. Just exited the spinal cord, and we have to divide the spinal nerve into 3 branches in the next few inches. How do we do that? And this bundling, especially the perineurium bundling, is very useful, because imagine that we can take this 1, 2, 3 fascicles and split them to the side, because they're already separated from the rest of the bundles. Very easy to introduce a left turn into those fascicles of nerves. We can take these 2 and bundle them together and split them out of the spinal nerve going up, and then the rest of the fascicles, bundles of the axons, can be branched out to turn downward. So this connective tissue separators, sheets, come really handy when we come to the branching of the spinal nerves, and we are going to see plenty of branching. So here is the typical branching of a spinal nerve. Here you can see the anterior and posterior dorsal roots, and here coming through the intervertebral foramen is the spinal nerve, a single rod-like entity. And take a closer look. As soon as the spinal nerve leaves the intervertebral foramen, there's this tiny skinny branch that makes a big U-turn and turns right back. This branch is the meningeal branch. The meningeal branch can exist or can come about because of those connective tissue coverings. Again, very easy to split a bundle of axons out of that large round spinal nerve. So this is the first branch, meningeal branch. Again, you can see it goes all the way back to the area of meninges. The second branch from a spinal nerve usually is this posterior or dorsal branch or ramus. This nerve or this bundle of axons carry nerve impulse to musculature of the back, but also collects sensory nerve impulses from the skin of the back. So we have the sensory and motor portion here. Again, spinal nerves are mixed. We have a mixture of sensory and motor bundles there. So we have the meningeal branch, we have the posterior branch, and the anterior branch is usually the main, longest branch, and this finds its destination depending on the segment of the spinal cord. We're not going to go into any details regarding this, but again, this is a good example how those connective tissue coverings can help forming the meningeal branch, the posterior branch, and the anterior branches from a single spinal nerve. You want to push branching to a maximum. Take a look at a nerve plexus. Nerve plexus is a meshwork of interconnecting nerves. So think about, for example, spinal nerve C2. Look, here is one branch, the second branch, third branch, but then look at this branch. It's turning all the way back here. Yet from the C2, there's a connection to C3, there's a connection to C1, and look at all these branches that are hanging down here at the end. So this highly extensive and highly complicated branching pattern is yet again facilitated, helped by those connective tissue coverings of the axons or fascicles. We have several nerve plexuses right next to the spinal cord, right after the spinal nerves exit the spinal cord. In the cervical region, we're going to see a little better view of this. We're going to mention the phrenic nerve, because the phrenic nerve supplies the diaphragm with nerve impulses, super important. From the brachial plexus, we'll connect that to the ulnar nerve. Ulnar nerve is world famous because this is a nerve that gives you the feeling that when you hit your funny bone. This ulnar nerve runs into the trochlea of the ulna, and when you hit that, it gives a tingling feeling of the pinky and the ring fingers. That ulnar nerve originates from the brachial plexus. We don't have any plexus in the thoracic region. In the lumbar plexus, let's mention as a representative there the obturator nerve. If you remember the obturator foramen from the skeleton, this huge opening, the obturator foramen on the coxal bone, actually has only two blood vessels and a nerve going through it, and here is this skinny nerve, obturator nerve, that goes through that very large obturator foramen. From the sacral set of segment of spinal cord, we mentioned sciatic nerve. Sciatic nerve goes by that greater sciatic notch of the ilium and eventually sends out branches to the thigh and to the leg. This is the thickest spinal nerve in the body. So that is originating from the sacral plexus. So plexus is pretty much an everyday event or picture in the life of a spinal nerves. And so here is a little better illustration of one of those plexuses, the cervical ones. You can see the highlighted 5 cervical spinal nerves. And phrenic nerve is supplied by C3 through C5 portion of the cervical plexus. This is the significance of clinical findings if somebody accidentally severs their spinal cord. The cervical region is highly vulnerable to that, so many bodily injuries, whether traffic accident, falling off a roof, horseback riding accident, motorcycle accident, bicycling accident, diving into a shallow pool, diving into a shallow riverbed from a boat, they tend to sever the spinal cord in the cervical area. So how could that possibly harm us? Well, imagine when the spinal cord is severed, nerve impulses no longer flow downward, they no longer descend through the spinal cord. And so if the spinal cord is severed at between the C1 and C2 spinal nerve, the diaphragm will not get any nerve impulses. If the spinal cord severed between the C2 and C3, the diaphragm will still not get any nerve impulses. If this person is lucky enough to have a spinal cord severed between the C3 and C4, now at least the C3 branch can carry some nerve impulses to the diaphragm, and so this person won't need a ventilator or any kind of respiratory assistance. So I'm going to stop here and record the second part of this lecture that's all about cord physiology. There's a ton of material there, and maybe it's a good time to take a break here and there. So the next recording, part 2, will start right here with the spinal cord physiology.